Some people rewrite a text 5 times and still never send it. Not because they don't know what to say, and not because they don't care. Usually, it's the opposite. To most people, it just looks like overthinking. Maybe insecurity. Maybe someone being emotionally complicated for no reason. But for certain people, communication was never just communication. It became something much heavier than that. A single sentence could feel permanent. A slight change in tone could feel dangerous. Even a delayed response could quietly trigger the feeling that something shifted. So before they reply, their mind starts scanning everything. The wording, the timing, the emotional weight behind each sentence. Not because they're trying to manipulate the conversation. Usually because somewhere along the way, their brain learned that relationships could change unexpectedly. And once your mind learns that, it stops treating communication casually. You can actually see this in small moments. Someone opens a message immediately, but replies hours later. They type for a while, delete everything, start over, leave the app, come back again. Meanwhile, the other person thinks, if they cared, they would have replied already. But internally, something completely different is happening. Because emotionally careful people often process connection slowly. Not shallowly, slowly. There's a difference. For some people, replying instantly feels natural. Their thoughts move outward easily. But for others, every response passes through layers of emotional filtering first. How will this sound? Did that feel too cold, too emotional, too distant, too interested? And by the time they finally settle on words, their nervous system already feels exhausted from the interaction. That's why emotionally aware people often look calm on the outside while their mind is running dozens of invisible calculations underneath, especially in close relationships. Because closeness increases emotional stakes. And when someone matters deeply to you, even tiny interactions can begin to feel psychologically important. A short reply suddenly feels loaded. A period at the end of a sentence feels meaningful. A shift in texting energy feels noticeable, not because they're irrational, but because their brain became highly trained to observe emotional patterns early. A lot of people like this grew up learning that moods mattered, tone mattered, timing mattered, the emotional atmosphere around other people mattered. So their brain adapted by becoming hyper-aware of subtle social changes. And over time, that awareness doesn't just disappear. It follows them into adulthood, into friendships, into dating, into texting, into every small interaction people say you're thinking too much about. But what looks like overthinking is often a nervous system trying to prevent emotional missteps before they happen. That's why some people can think about replying all day while still struggling to send a simple message. Because for them, communication feels tied to emotional safety. And safety changes the way the brain behaves, especially for people who fear being misunderstood, or becoming emotionally too much, or saying something that changes the connection permanently. So they slow down, not because they're careless, because they care deeply enough to become cautious. And honestly, people like this often feel misunderstood in modern communication culture. Everything today rewards speed. Fast replies, fast reactions, fast conversations. But emotionally reflective people usually don't experience connection in real time like that. They experience it internally first, long before they express it outwardly. Sometimes they've already thought about you for hours before sending a 2-word reply. Sometimes they care far more than their communication style appears to show. And sometimes the people who seem emotionally distant are actually emotionally overloaded. Just quietly, internally, without knowing how to explain it properly. The difficult part is that people rarely see invisible emotional effort. They only see behavior. So one person sees delayed replies, while the other person experiences emotional processing, caution, and mental replay happening beneath the surface. And the gap between those two experiences creates misunderstanding. But understanding this doesn't mean every delayed reply is healthy. And it doesn't mean emotional avoidance should be romanticized. Sometimes people do avoid vulnerability. Sometimes people do shut down emotionally. But there's also a difference between emotional avoidance and emotional carefulness. One disconnects because it feels nothing. The other hesitates because it feels too much. And from the outside, those two things can look almost identical. That's why emotionally intelligent people are often misunderstood, because their internal experience is much deeper than their visible behavior suggests. So if you're someone who rewrites texts repeatedly, or mentally rehearses conversations before sending them, or thinks about people long before you know how to respond. You're probably not emotionless. You're probably someone whose mind learned to treat connection carefully. Not better, not worse, just differently. And sometimes the behaviors people criticize most are actually adaptations your nervous system built a long time ago to protect emotional connection the best way it knew how.